The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning, the kind of silence that hung in the air when people sensed something important was about to happen. The audience benches slowly filled, people settling in with the subtle rustle of clothes and whispers. Judge Judy's courtroom was always tense, but today felt different. Something sharper. Something uncomfortable. The bailiff stepped forward. "Case of Collins versus Myers," he announced. An older man entered first, walking slowly but with an unmistakable dignity. His hand rested lightly on a polished wooden cane, and dark sunglasses shielded his eyes. Though time and hardship had carved deep lines across his face, he held himself with the posture of someone who had survived more than anyone in the room could imagine. His name was Thomas Collins, a retired veteran who had lost his sight while serving overseas. Despite his disability, he remained calm, collected, and polite as he navigated toward the plaintiff's podium. Right behind him, almost pushing her way in, was the defendant, Karen Myers. Karen looked irritated from the moment she appeared. Her hands were glued to her hips, her lips were pressed into a thin line, and her entire expression radiated impatience, as though the very act of being in the courtroom was beneath her. She rolled her eyes dramatically as she took her place at the defendant's podium, making sure everyone saw her annoyance. Judge Judy entered, as stern and commanding as ever. The audience straightened instinctively, even Karen stopped her eye-rolling long enough to stand. When everyone was seated again, Judge Judy flipped through the case file with quick, sharp movements. "All right," she said. "Mr. Collins, let's start with you. What exactly is the reason you've brought Ms. Myers to court today?" Before Thomas could answer, Karen let out an exaggerated sigh. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she muttered loudly. "He's going to take forever to explain. Can't we just skip to the part where he admits he's exaggerating?" A ripple of discomfort spread through the audience. Thomas didn't react right away, though his fingers tightened slightly around his cane. Judge Judy's eyes snapped toward Karen, sharp and unblinking. "I'll decide who is taking too long," she said, her tone edged with warning. Karen folded her arms, frowning like a teenager who had been scolded by a parent. Thomas cleared his throat gently. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "I am here because Ms. Myers damaged my service dog's training equipment and refused to compensate me. Without that equipment, it becomes much harder for me to move around safely." Karen let out a laugh, high-pitched, mocking, and painfully out of place. "His dog is better trained than he is," she said loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "He doesn't need all that gear. He just likes playing the victim." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. A woman in the audience shook her head. Even the bailiff frowned. Thomas didn't raise his voice or lash out. He simply stood quietly, letting the insult pass him like a cold wind. But Judge Judy did not let it slide. She leaned forward slowly, eyes narrowing. Everyone in the courtroom recognized the look. It was the expression Judge Judy wore right before delivering a verbal hammer blow. "Ms. Myers," she said, voice dangerously calm, "mocking a man who lost his vision while serving this country is not only inappropriate, it is despicable." Karen rolled her eyes again. "Oh, please. People lose things all the time. Why should I tiptoe around him just because he—" The audience collectively inhaled, and even Karen seemed to realize she had walked into dangerous territory. But she couldn't help herself. She smirked, as if she believed she was the only reasonable person in the room. Thomas remained composed, though pain flickered briefly across his face. He stood a little straighter, as though reminding himself that he had faced much worse than rude strangers. Still, the humiliation hung in the air, settling heavily around him. Judge Judy turned back to him with surprising gentleness. "Mr. Collins," she said, "go on." Thomas nodded gratefully. "My service dog, Ranger, depends on his harness and guiding equipment. Ms. Myers damaged them during an encounter we had at the community park. She claimed my dog was in her way in." Karen interrupted again, her voice dripping with disdain. "He's leaving out the part where his dog walked in front of me. Maybe if he could actually see where he was going." That was it. The final crack. The room had been uncomfortable before, but now the air felt electric with disbelief. Some audience members stared at Karen in open disgust. Others looked toward Judge Judy, waiting, almost eager, for her to respond. Judge Judy's expression hardened like stone. Her voice, when she finally spoke, cut through the room like a blade. "Ms. Myers, you are this close to being removed from my courtroom." Karen straightened but didn't back down. She lifted her chin defiantly. "I'm just telling the truth." "No," Judge Judy snapped. "You're being rude, ignorant, and unnecessarily cruel." Karen went silent, at least momentarily. Thomas shifted slightly, and though he could not see the room, he could feel the heaviness of the moment. He exhaled quietly. "Your Honor, I'm not here to cause trouble," he said softly. "I simply want her to take responsibility for the damage she caused." Judge Judy gave a small nod. "And we will get to the bottom of that. But first," she turned back to Karen, "you are going to keep your mouth shut until I tell you otherwise. Understood?" Karen muttered something under her breath but said nothing more. The tension in the courtroom settled, but the damage was already done. Everyone could sense that this case was no longer just about a broken harness. It had become something bigger, a moment of truth about character, respect, and how people treated those who had sacrificed more than most. And as the first part of the case unfolded, one thing became clear to everyone watching: Karen had stepped into a battle she wasn't prepared for. And Judge Judy was only getting started. The courtroom settled into an uneasy quiet after Judge Judy delivered her warning. Karen shifted restlessly, lifting her chin as if daring anyone to challenge her again. But despite her posturing, there was a tremor of uncertainty buried beneath her annoyance. The audience, however, seemed energized. They leaned forward in their seats, sensing that they were watching something that would leave an impression long after the case ended. Thomas adjusted his stance, one hand resting lightly on the podium while the other held his cane. Though he couldn't see Karen's expression, he could hear the contempt in her voice, feel the weight of her mockery. But he had learned long ago, during sleepless nights in foreign deserts and chaotic battlefields, that the world was full of people who didn't understand struggle. It was not worth returning hatred with hatred. He steadied himself. Judge Judy tapped her pen against the bench. "All right, Mr. Collins. Start from the beginning. Tell me exactly what happened the day your equipment was damaged." Thomas nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor. It was last Friday, late in the afternoon. I was taking Ranger for his usual walk in Lakeside Park. He's trained to help me navigate safely. We move slowly, and I follow his lead. Everything was normal until we approached the footpath near the lake." He paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. The audience listened silently. "I heard someone jogging behind us. I tried to shift a little to the right so they could pass, but before I could do that, someone shouted." He managed a small, humorless smile. "It was Ms. Myers." Karen scoffed loudly. "Obviously. I was trying to run, and you and your dog were blocking the way like a pair of statues." Judge Judy raised a hand sharply. "Did I say you could speak?" Karen opened her mouth, then closed it with visible irritation. "Continue, Mr. Collins," Judge Judy said. Thomas swallowed gently. I turned slightly, and Ranger positioned himself to help me move aside. But Ms. Myers didn't slow down. Instead, she ran right into Ranger's side. I lost my balance because Ranger reacted to the impact. When I stumbled, she yelled at me for being in her way. He hesitated, then added softly, "She grabbed at Ranger's guiding harness. That harness is specially fitted. It has a metal handle, custom straps, and internal supports. Pulling on it the wrong way can strain his back or break the frame." And that's exactly what happened. The frame bent, and one of the buckles cracked. Judge Judy turned to Karen. "Is this true?" Karen threw her hands up dramatically. "He makes it sound like I attacked his dog. I barely touched it. That thing jumped into me. I shouldn't be held responsible for a defective piece of equipment that snaps like cheap plastic." Thomas stiffened. "It's not cheap. It's reinforced titanium." Judge Judy lifted an eyebrow. Ms. Myers, did you or did you not grab his dog's harness? Karen smirked as if she were proud of herself. I only did it because he was about to fall, okay? I was doing him a favor. Funny, Judge Judy replied dryly, because a moment ago, you said his dog jumped into you. The courtroom erupted with a few stifled laughs. Karen flushed but held on to her smug expression like a person refusing to let go of a sinking raft. Your Honor, Thomas continued gently, after she bent the harness, she blamed me and said I should train Ranger better. I explained that he's a service dog, and she said, he paused, reluctant to say it aloud. Judge Judy leaned forward. She said what? Thomas sighed. She said people like me shouldn't be out alone if we can't keep up with the rest of the world. The room fell into an icy, stunned silence. Judge Judy's face darkened deeply, one of the rare moments where her disapproval became something heavier, something close to anger. She slowly removed her glasses, folded them, and set them on the bench with deliberate precision. Ms. Myers, she said, her voice icy, did you make that comment? Karen shrugged, as if it meant nothing. Well, I might have said something like that, but I didn't mean it in a mean way. I was just being honest. Thomas lowered his head slightly, not in shame, but in sadness. He had endured countless challenges as a blind veteran, learning to move without sight, accepting help when necessary, rebuilding his life from the ground up. But what always stung the deepest were the words of people who believed he no longer had value. Judge Judy shook her head slowly. You have a very twisted idea of honesty. Karen opened her mouth to object, but Judge Judy raised a hand again. No. I've heard enough from you for the moment. The judge returned her attention to Thomas. Mr. Collins, how much does it cost to replace the damaged equipment? A full replacement, including fittings, adjustments, and training recalibration, comes to $1,280, he answered. I provided the receipts. The bailiff handed the documents to Judge Judy. She examined them with swift, experienced eyes. These are legitimate, she confirmed. Karen scoffed loudly. Over $1,000 for a dog leash? Give me a break. Thomas winced, not from the insult, but from how ignorant she sounded. Ranger wasn't a pet with a basic collar. He was trained for years, a partner who allowed Thomas to live independently. Judge Judy snapped her head toward Karen. It is not a dog leash. It is adaptive medical equipment. And judging by your behavior so far, it is worth more than your attitude. A ripple of applause rose from the courtroom before the bailiff called for silence. Thomas's posture softened a little. He still held onto his composure, but gratitude flickered across his expression, gratitude that someone was finally holding Karen accountable. Mr. Collins, Judge Judy said more gently, did you ask Ms. Myers to compensate you for the damage at the time? Yes, Your Honor. I asked her politely. But she refused. She walked away before I could say anything else. Karen folded her arms, scowling. Of course I refused. It wasn't my fault. And besides, he was dramatizing everything. She gestured vaguely toward Thomas. Look at him. He's practically milking this for attention. The audience gasped audibly this time. Even the bailiff looked furious. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Thomas's calm cracked. He didn't raise his voice, but there was steel behind every syllable. I did not ask to lose my vision, he said quietly. I did not ask for a life where simple tasks become challenges. I certainly did not ask for pity. All I want is fairness and respect. The room fell silent again, deeply moved. Judge Judy nodded slowly. Mr. Collins, you deserve both. She turned to Karen again, her tone shifting into something sharper, no longer simply scolding, but preparing to deliver the lesson Karen clearly needed. Ms. Myers, what I see here is a man who served his country. A man who lost his eyesight in the line of duty, protecting freedoms you take for granted. And yet, you chose to mock him. You chose to belittle him. You chose to behave as though his disability made him inferior. Karen rolled her eyes again. Oh, please. Don't turn this into some patriotic speech. That did it. Judge Judy's voice rose, not to shout, but with the kind of force that shook the air. This is not a speech. This is the truth. And you would do well to learn the difference. Karen flinched for the first time. And let me tell you something else, the judge said. The only person in this courtroom behaving like a burden to society is you. The audience broke into applause so loud the bailiff had to intervene again. Karen looked stunned, her lips parted, her bravado momentarily shattered. She wasn't used to being called out so publicly. Thomas remained still, but his shoulders relaxed slightly. It was the first breath of relief he had taken since the case began. Judge Judy lifted the case file again. "We are not finished," she said. "Not even close." And the courtroom knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. Karen shifted uneasily at the defendant's podium, finally realizing that her usual tactics, sarcasm, eye-rolling, and loud indignation, weren't working here. Judge Judy's glare held her in place like a pinned insect. The audience remained silent, waiting to see what would unfold next, sensing that they hadn't even reached the peak of the confrontation. Judge Judy folded her hands neatly on the bench, her voice measured but firm. "Before I make any judgments, I want to be absolutely clear about what happened that day in the park. Mr. Collins, after Ms. Myers grabbed the dog's harness and damaged the frame, what did she do next?" Thomas took a slow breath. "Ranger lost his balance, and I nearly fell. I managed to steady myself, but I was shaken. Ms. Myers started yelling at me, saying I should stay home if I couldn't see where I was going." Karen jumped in despite the warning. "Because it's true. I mean, come on, why is this my responsibility? I'm not a babysitter." Judge Judy snapped her head toward her. "Do you have a disability, Ms. Myers?" "No," Karen muttered. "Then perhaps you should be grateful you have full use of your senses instead of attacking someone who doesn't." Karen scoffed again, but her voice had lost some of its sharpness. She suddenly glanced around as if hoping someone in the audience agreed with her. "They didn't." Thomas continued. "After she shouted at me, I tried to calmly explain that Ranger was my service dog and that the harness was damaged. She told me I was trying to scam her." Karen nodded proudly. "Well, I mean, I didn't know he was blind. He had sunglasses on. People wear sunglasses all the time." Judge Judy's jaw dropped slightly. "Are you actually saying you thought he pretended to be blind?" "I don't know. Maybe. You saw him with a service dog. So? People do weird stuff to get attention." The audience groaned loudly. A man in the back muttered, "Unbelievable." Thomas stood silently, his grip tightening around his cane. He didn't want pity, he hated pity, but he couldn't help but feel the sting of Karen's accusations. His entire life had changed because of his service. He had spent countless hours learning to navigate darkness. And yet here was a woman who reduced all his struggles to a performance. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair, lips pressed tight. "Mr. Collins, what happened after she accused you of scamming her?" Thomas answered softly. "I asked her if she could stay while I checked Ranger. I needed to make sure he wasn't injured. She said she had better things to do and walked off." Judge Judy shook her head, astonished by Karen's behavior. "You didn't even check if the dog was hurt?" Karen shrugged, arms crossed. "Why would I? It didn't look hurt. It barked at me." Thomas corrected her gently. "Ranger does not bark unless he's frightened or confused. He was startled by the impact and by being pulled." "Well, maybe you should train it better." "It's not my fault if the dog gets scared easily," Karen said with an unapologetic flick of her wrist. Judge Judy's eyes widened. "Do you know how hard it is to startle a trained service dog?" Karen rolled her eyes. "Not my problem. I'm not a dog trainer." Judge Judy leaned forward with a deadly calm. "No. But you are responsible for your actions. And your actions caused damage." Karen threw her hands up. "So what? It's just money. I don't see why this is such a big deal. Thomas's breath hitched slightly. It isn't about the money, Ms. Myers, he said, voice trembling for the first time. It's about the dignity you stripped from me when you mocked my disability and walked away like I was nothing. That landed like a weight in the room. The audience sat deeply still. Judge Judy placed her glasses back on her face, studying Karen with a look of pure disbelief. Ms. Myers, your attitude suggests you think the world revolves around your convenience. Let me make something perfectly clear, it does not. Karen tried to speak, but the judge continued without pause. There are people who serve this country. They give their time, their health, and sometimes their abilities so people like you can run freely in a park without fear. And you choose to repay that sacrifice with cruelty? Judy shook her head. Unacceptable doesn't even begin to describe your behavior. Karen looked defiantly at Judge Judy. I didn't ask him to serve, okay? That was his choice. Not my responsibility. The room gasped in disbelief. One elderly woman pressed a hand against her heart, shocked. Thomas's expression froze in stunned silence. That one sentence hurt more than every insult she had thrown so far. Judge Judy inhaled sharply, not in anger, but in something deeper, something disappointed and outraged at once. You didn't ask him to serve, she repeated slowly. But you are living in a country protected by people who did. And you take advantage of every freedom provided by people you believe you owe nothing to. Karen shrugged, trying to look bored. I don't see how that has anything to do with me jogging in a park. The judge shook her head. Because it reveals your character, Ms. Myers. It shows a level of self-centeredness I have rarely witnessed in this courtroom, and I've seen a lot. The audience murmured in agreement. Judge Judy turned back to Thomas. Mr. Collins, I have one more question. When you approached her after the incident, what was Ms. Myers' exact response? Thomas nodded slowly. She said, You're blind, not helpless. If you can't afford new equipment, maybe you shouldn't have a dog. A collective intake of breath spread throughout the courtroom. Even Karen seemed startled that her own words, repeated aloud, sounded so cruel. Judge Judy stared at her for a long, silent moment. Did you say that? Karen fidgeted. Something like that, maybe. But I didn't mean it the way it sounds. Judge Judy drew in a steady breath. Ms. Myers, you keep claiming you didn't mean your statements that way. Yet somehow, every single one of them comes out poisoned with arrogance and disrespect. Karen opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came. Let me explain something you clearly don't understand, Judge Judy continued. A service dog is not a luxury. It is not a fashion statement. It is a vital part of this man's ability to live independently. Damaging his equipment is the equivalent of ripping a cane out of someone's hand or knocking away someone's wheelchair. Karen blinked, as if hearing this analogy for the first time. And mocking him for his disability, Judge Judy added sharply, is the moral equivalent of kicking someone while they're down. The audience murmured, nodding passionately. Karen swallowed, her confidence shrinking by the second. She was starting to realize that nothing she said could make her look better now. Judge Judy sat up straighter. We will get to the verdict soon. But before we do, I want Ms. Myers to tell me why she thinks she does not owe this man compensation. Karen hesitated, her bravado finally cracking. But her pride pushed back. Because, she scrambled for a reason. Because I didn't break it on purpose. And because he shouldn't have been walking in the middle of the path. He made it hard for everyone else. So, Judge Judy said slowly, your argument is that disabled people should make themselves invisible for your convenience. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Karen froze, realizing she had walked right into the truth of her own behavior. Judge Judy leaned forward, her final question for this part landing with the weight of a hammer. Ms. Myers, do you believe blind individuals should stay home so that you can jog faster? Karen gaped at her, unable to answer. The silence that followed was suffocating. Everyone in the courtroom knew the real judgment against Karen had already been made, by her own words. Karen didn't answer Judge Judy's question. She stood there frozen, her mouth slightly open, her face pale under the harsh courtroom lighting. Every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on her, waiting, judging, questioning how she could possibly justify the words she had spoken so freely before. Judge Judy tapped her pen once, an unmistakable signal that whatever patience she had left was hanging by a thread. "I'll take your silence," she said slowly, "as the closest thing to honesty you've shown today." Karen shifted uncomfortably, arms wrapped around herself as though trying to shrink. The judge continued. "Mr. Collins, I'd like to hear more about how the damaged equipment affected you after the incident. What did you do?" Thomas drew a steady breath. "Well, Your Honor, without the harness, Ranger doesn't know how to guide me properly. He depends on that structure to understand my movements. Without it, I couldn't navigate safely. I had to call my neighbor to help me get home." Karen rolled her eyes again, though this time with less certainty. "You could have walked slowly." Judge Judy snapped. "He is blind, Ms. Myers. He cannot walk slowly around obstacles he cannot see." Karen shrank under the judge's glare. Thomas continued, "I had to cancel appointments for the next 2 days. I rely on Ranger for everything, shopping, doctor visits, even just going outside for air. Without the harness, I'm stuck. It's like losing my sight all over again." His voice wavered, just slightly, but he didn't let it break. The room hung on his words, struck silent by the rawness of what he described. Karen let out a weak huff. "It can't be that serious." Judge Judy leaned forward sharply. "You have no idea how serious it is because you have never had to rely on anything other than your own convenience." Karen bit her lip, but instead of apologizing, she crossed her arms and looked away. Judge Judy, undeterred, flipped through the papers again. "The damages are $1,280, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Thomas replied. "And you asked Ms. Myers to simply look at the damage and consider paying?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And her response," Judge Judy said, glancing over her glasses at Karen, "was to accuse you of scamming her and walk away." "Yes." Karen muttered, "It sounded like a scam." Judge Judy slammed her pen down on the bench, making Karen jump. Why would a blind veteran invent a story in a public park? Why would he choose you, of all people, to scam? You aren't wealthy, important, or special. You were simply the closest person he encountered. Gasps of laughter and disbelief spread through the audience. Karen flushed. "That's rude." "Yes," Judge Judy said sharply. "But unlike you, I'm being rude while telling the truth." A few chuckles bubbled up again before the bailiff quieted the room. Judge Judy exhaled, turning back to Thomas. "Mr. Collins, you have been patient, dignified, and respectful. That speaks volumes about your character. I'm sorry you had to endure this." Thomas bowed his head slightly. "Thank you, Your Honor." Then Judge Judy shifted her focus to Karen, who looked increasingly small behind the podium. "Ms. Myers, here's what's going to happen." The entire courtroom leaned forward. Judge Judy continued, "You are going to compensate this man the full $1,280 for the replacement harness. You are also going to pay an additional $250 for the disruption and inconvenience caused by your actions." Karen gasped. "What? That's not fair. I didn't mean to break anything." "You didn't mean to act like a rude, thoughtless human being either," Judge Judy shot back, "and yet here we are." The audience erupted into approving murmurs. Karen sputtered. "That's not even the worst of it," Judge Judy added. Karen blinked. "It's not?" "No," Judge Judy said, her voice like steel. "Because before you leave this courtroom, you are going to look at Mr. Collins, and you are going to apologize." Karen recoiled as though she'd been slapped. "No. I don't want to." "You don't have a choice," Judge Judy replied. "That man stood here and treated you with respect despite every vile remark you threw at him. The least you can do is acknowledge the harm you caused." Thomas spoke gently, "Your Honor, she doesn't have to." Judge Judy interrupted, "Oh yes, she does." The room quieted, every eye trained on Karen. Judge Judy's voice softened, but only slightly. "An apology isn't just for him, Ms. Myers. It's for you. Maybe it will teach you something about empathy, responsibility, and basic decency." Karen's eyes darted to Thomas. For a moment, she looked as though she wanted to argue again, but something in Thomas's calm, steady posture broke through her stubbornness. She swallowed, rolled her shoulders, then exhaled. Finally, she lifted her gaze and forced the words out. "I'm sorry." It sounded like it hurt to say. "I shouldn't have said what I did. Or grabbed your dog. I didn't realize how important that stuff was." Thomas nodded, accepting the apology without bitterness. "Thank you." But Judge Judy wasn't finished. "Ms. Myers," she continued, "if you ever encounter someone with a disability again, I strongly suggest you treat them with kindness instead of contempt. One day, life may challenge you in ways you cannot imagine, and the last thing you will want is someone like yourself looking down on you." Karen lowered her eyes, unable to disagree. Judge Judy straightened her papers. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff for a total of $1,530. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Applause erupted instantly, loud, passionate, approving. The bailiff made a half-hearted attempt to shush the audience, but even he was smiling. Thomas bowed his head in gratitude, relief washing over him like a quiet tide. Ranger, sitting patiently by his side, tail thumping softly, seemed to sense the tension had eased. Karen, meanwhile, looked stunned, embarrassed, humbled, and for once completely silent. She gathered her things without a word and left with far less confidence than she had entered. As Thomas prepared to leave, Judge Judy offered him a gentle smile. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Collins. And thank you for your service." He nodded, touched by her sincerity. "Thank you, Your Honor. Truly." The bailiff stepped forward to assist Thomas out of the courtroom. The audience parted respectfully, some offering soft smiles or nods of acknowledgement, silent gestures of appreciation for his strength and dignity. For many watching, this wasn't just another court case. It was a reminder of respect, humanity, and how one voice standing firm can put a bully in their place. And for those who saw Karen's mocking grin crumble under the weight of truth and justice, it truly was a moment that made America cheer.